Welcome back to Talk of the Town. I'm Steve Noxon, your host, and joining me on the phone right now is State Senator Sampson. Senator Sampson represents the 16th State Senate District. Senator Sampson, how are you this morning?
Well, good morning, Steve. You do such a good job. I really listened to you this morning and was reminded just how thorough you are and how I think you understand the issues more deeply than a lot of my colleagues I serve with. And that's a sad statement on that, but it's a compliment for you, and it's much deserved.
Well, thank you very much. And being much older than you are, I do have the benefit of years on you for my having lived a life. So there is that aspect of it as well.
I don't know how true that is, but I'm going to take it regardless. The funny thing is that all the candidates sound the same. It doesn't even matter what political party they're from. I find that going around the state and going to various, campaign candidate forums and things like that, the Democrats are trying their best, their darndest, in fact, to sound like Republicans. Suddenly they're all fiscal conservatives and they're tax cutters and they're trying to right the ship as far as the crime wave, and it just shocks me because I serve with a lot of these people, and that's not what they are. The governor of the state of Connecticut going around in his political campaign trying to claim that he's a tax cutter is one of the most absurd things you can possibly imagine. The Democrats have been raising taxes year after year since I've been there. 12 years ago when I first got elected, the state budget was $17 billion. See, that was the whole state budget, including the federal funds that pass through the state budget and, for Medicaid. And today, that number, without that, which is $4 or $5 billion, is probably around $25 billion. So, we've increased the state budget maybe 50% in 10 or 12 years, and they want to, suggest that somehow they're reducing spending. And spending is the true measure of taxes, by the way. If you want to know whether there's been a tax cut or not, look at the left column, not the right one. Look at the spending column, because that's the amount of tax you're actually contributing to the state government. And on the crime issue, there's a dozen bills that passed over the last decade or so that have contributed to the crime wave we're facing, and the idea that somehow they're working in the opposite direction, I just don't see it.
Excuse me, you caught me in the middle of a sip of water. It has been rather interesting to see the messaging that's coming out, especially since, I guess they're just expecting people to have short memories. The first 3 years of the Lamont administration, he's raised taxes and attempted to raise more. The leading Democrats in both the House and the Senate have actually proposed many more tax increases that did not go through, such as the mansion tax, that you just know for a fact they're going to come back up because they never go away. And I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the budget, $25 billion, and then you see on top of that the governor is claiming $6 billion in surplus, that's just an astronomical. I know a lot of that came from the federal government, but that's an astronomical amount of money to have sucked out of the economy.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I'm sure you've seen it reported that, Republicans, we've been advocating for returning that money to the taxpayers. At this point in time, who needs it more? Does the state government need to be, keeping that in a bank account socked away, or should we be returning that to the people it belongs to? And it's a direct indication that they have taxed too much. If you end up with $6 or $7 billion in the bank after collecting your taxes, that means you screwed up. You actually took more than you needed for that cycle. The whole conversation is kind of convoluted, though, Steve, because it's hard to suggest that we have any kind of surplus in a state where we have $150 billion long-term obligations and debt. That's weighing on everyone. In fact, Connecticut has the highest per person debt in the entire country, around $60,000. So to suggest that we have a surplus kind of confuses people, but the surplus is only reflective of the current 2-year budget cycle. And there's a lot of things you can do with that money, but the number one thing is to return it back to the people. And if you're going to use it for anything in government, you should be paying down those long-term obligations.
Well, I've made this argument many times over the last couple of months, and that is you can't claim a surplus when you've taken on more debt. And that's the dirty little secret here that many people aren't talking about. We have increased our debt load under this administration year after year after year. We were told we were going to be on a debt diet, yet we're still going to the bonding committee, and we're still borrowing money on top of the money that we had to borrow to maintain the unemployment trust fund. That debt burden was placed on businesses when it easily could have been taken taken, handled by this budget surplus that the governor's crowing about. So I find it disingenuous to claim that you have a budget surplus when you haven't even met your obligations.
Completely. Yeah, and they have no desire to. I mean, they are more than content to continue down the path that the Democrats have been on for 40 years in the state, which is just simply expanding government at all costs. And, very little interest in good policy or creating economic growth. They just want to continue to write policy that has one purpose, and that one purpose is to ensure their electoral success in the next cycle. Everything else be damned, whether it is the quality of life of Connecticut residents, the safety of Connecticut residents, or the financial viability of the state itself. They will address those issues only to the extent that is absolutely necessary to avoid them complete embarrassment and being thrown out of office. And that's what we're witnessing right now. This past session, there was a juvenile justice bill passed on a bipartisan basis at the Capitol. And, I voted for it, and I think so did everyone else. But it was a tiny step back in the right direction, and for political purposes only. The majority knew that they were going to get tagged hard for their laundry list of bad bills. They let violent felons out of prison early. They restricted police chases, erasing criminal records, putting more and more mandates on police officers, undermining their immunity, the police accountability bill, and so on. All of that stuff adds up to where we are today. Not to mention, making us a super sanctuary state and effectively protecting violent criminals who happen to be undocumented aliens. You could really fill a book with all of the bad policies that have led to the crime wave in the state. And here it is, they're coming up on this election. They're like, oh, geez, we have to do something. So they slapped together this juvenile justice bill, which it was a good bill, and I was happy to vote for it. But it was there for political purposes and only because they felt the absolute need to. And that's the same thing with the governor's, supposed, $600 million in tax cuts, which are not really even tax cuts. Most of that is social programs, expanding, benefits, giving out checks to, people that have children, which you can talk about that policy, whether it's good or bad, but it's not a tax cut. Taking money from one segment of society and giving it to another segment is a transfer program. That's another entitlement. That is not a tax cut.
Yeah, interesting you brought up the juvenile justice bill juvenile crime bill, because a week or so ago, Chris Powell referenced this in a column. The chief of police for the city of Meriden was interviewed, and he said that almost all of the chiefs of police around the state agree that the juvenile crime bill did nothing but further burden the police while doing nothing to reduce juvenile crime. Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is, it's all disguised, Steve. Most of what you pass in the legislature is not policy. They pass bill titles and rhetoric. That's what they're really good at. I mean, I have a very independent voting record. I don't necessarily follow my own party even. So I get left out alone on a lot of bills that I stand on principle, and I will cast a solo no vote. And of course, when that happens, it's really easy to point fingers and say, "Look at that guy! Why is he doing that?" Well, the answer is because I'm a principled lawmaker. I read the bills, and I know what I'm voting for. But you get tagged because of the titles of these bills, and obviously, it's the game is rigged even ahead of time. They put these things out there for the express purpose of making sure that they know that certain people will vote, no or yes, given the circumstances, and that they can use it against them for an upcoming campaign. It's an ugly, ugly way of doing business, but sadly, that's the way it is. And the only way to solve all that is with an informed electorate, and that's why I do probably more educational and town hall forum type things than just about anybody in our state government, because I'm trying to make sure that the people in my district at least are informed. They know what's going on at the state capitol. They understand these bills, so that when various legislators across the spectrum vote on them, they understand exactly where they stand.
Well, and I appreciate your efforts in that regard, because I remember a few years back I went to a town hall meeting in Meriden, where I live, and there was one state representative there. This was her first term, who basically just came to the room to complain about how little she was getting paid, and nothing else. That was basically her whole reason for being there. And the room was filled with people. It was like in the middle of the tolls debate. It was right after the bill for tolls had been released, so everybody had a chance to see what the actual bill said. And I remember I asked them if they had read the bill. This woman said, "No, I haven't had time." This was like 2 days after the bill had been released. And I said, "Ma'am, I don't mean you any disrespect here, but I've read it 3 times already. It's not that long. How can you not put aside 10 minutes to read a bill that you're now supporting and going to be voting in favor of?" And it's that kind of stuff that you talk about going out and informing people. A lot of these times, these people have these town hall meetings with and they don't even know what they're talking about.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and they don't know what they're talking about. The vast majority of people in the legislature are voting on bills without ever reading them. And in fact, I mean, I don't want to attack all of my colleagues in both parties, but I will tell you, I mean, you couldn't even possibly read all of the bills. I mean, even if you wanted to. I vote no on many occasions simply because I haven't had the opportunity, because they didn't give me the opportunity. The example that you just used is completely different, though. That is something where that is at the top of every voter's mind. It's a major issue. Everybody knows what's going on. You ought to be informed 100% on what's going on. But they throw bills at us. I can't tell you, Steve, how many times at 2 a.m, everybody is just like completely had it. It's been a long day. We've been debating on this and that, and they will just come out with some 500-page bill on God knows what, and they will hand it to you, still steaming from the photocopier. Hey, we're voting in 7 minutes. It's like, what? And it's like, well, I can't vote for that. Well,
yeah.
Take your chances. And so many times the state budget has come out, and the budget is 1,000 pages long. And the only thing that anyone cares about is what the last 3 pages say, because those are the ECS runs, the education cost-sharing grants for each of the towns. And it's like, well, if my town is getting education money, I have to vote for it. Forget what's in the 1,000 pages, just what it says, and they present it that way. Both parties do. They hand it to you, and you say, here's the budget. And by the way, the important stuff is on the last page. It's really, really bad, Steve. We need...
It's a manipulation of the system. And we've seen it just getting worse and worse and worse. We saw it at the federal level with that PACT Act for veterans, where they tacked on an additional $400 million for Ukraine. And then when some Republicans voted against it because of that, they were saying, "See, you're against veterans." I mean, it's a dirty game, and it's getting worse.
Right, and it's hard to be one of those people that is doing your job the right way, because you are effectively being herded. We know what we're doing. Yeah, you got to vote for this, for this. And I just don't play that game. And I have several great colleagues in the House. My dear friend Gail Master Francesco, who succeeded me in the House. She's the strongest, most hard-working legislator, I think, in the House of Representatives in Connecticut. And she reads all the bills, and she has a voting record that looks like mine, because she stands up. We don't even talk about these things ahead of time most of the time, Steve. It just so happens that I read the bill, and she read the bill, and we were the only 2 no's in the whole place. It's like, well, how did that happen? Well, it's because we're doing our job. And, the hard part is that when election time comes, it's people like us that we get singled out as being oddballs or extremists.
Well, I've made the argument here repeatedly that the term extremist has been so diluted to the point now where it's basically meaningless, because especially when it comes to things like the abortion issue, the extreme position that is supposedly being staked out by the Republicans and by people like Bob Stefanowski is that, a 15-week or 12-week, whatever, restriction is extreme, but having an abortion up to the day of birth, that's a mainstream opinion. These people are completely they've lost their way here on these things, and it's just to smear someone else as an extremist because they're within the actual mainstream. I think 80% of the people polled support some limit on abortion. It's a cheap tactic.
Well said. No, and you're absolutely right about that. I've been saying it since the very, very beginning. It's the Democrats that have the extreme position. I don't call them extremists, but I do believe that position is extreme. And it is not in keeping with the vast majority of the people of the country. People, do not believe in late-term, abortions, that happen up until the day of birth. That's crazy. The number of people that actually believe that's good policy is probably, in the single digits or less. And the idea that the entire Democratic Party is pushing that position, even the governor has come out and said he doesn't believe in any restrictions on abortion. In the last legislative session, they had a constitutional amendment that they had proposed and went through my committee, the Government Administration and Elections Committee, to put a constitutional amendment in Connecticut to eliminate the potential even for restrictions on abortion. Anything. Parental notification, restrictions on types of abortions, restrictions on the timing of abortions. They wanted it all. And, I voted against it and, made quite a passionate speech in our committee. And the day that they were going to bring that bill to the Senate floor, they knew I was ready for them, and it got pushed aside. And thank heavens. I don't know whether it was because they didn't want to take the time and they had more important or pressing things in their mind to do, or they were concerned about the vote ultimately and the political ramifications of it, and which I hope is the case. I hope that they are concerned enough to not put that kind of thing forward. But what concerns me, Steve, is that they are going farther and farther to the left all the time. We are experiencing policies going through the Connecticut legislature that are just shocking. I mean, whether it's this constant, harping on the woke policy and the identity politics and trying to make the makeup of our state government based on race and gender instead of based on merit. And, the expansion of social programs and, the authoritarian nature of government, having the power to dictate, mandatory vaccines for people. Really, we're losing our identity as free citizens. And Connecticut is one of those states that is kind of doing a lot of the experimenting on what the Democratic government can get away with. And we have to push back as hard as we can.
Well, and the weird thing about that is, too, we see this happening in other places like California. We see it happening in places like New York City. We see it happening all over the place in some of these very, very blue states and blue districts. And we see the results. I mean, California people can't even turn on their lights in California. They're telling people they can't run their air conditioners during a heat wave, but they're forcing them to buy electric cars, which they're then telling them not to charge. The number of just radical, extreme proposals that are coming out of California that we here in Connecticut seem to want to emulate, and if actually in the last session put into law following their climate policies. Why would you repeat the mistakes that is bringing a state to its knees here in Connecticut? Right.
Yeah, you're referring to a bill that effectively would outlaw gasoline-powered vehicles by 2035. That's the law in California, and our law in Connecticut says we will do whatever California does, which is just madness, as you mentioned. I mean, why would we do that ever?
Yeah.
And it's not the first time. We have a lot of laws in Connecticut that say we will do whatever someone else says or does. And I don't understand that. We have a representative system, and we have people elected to do the job. And, so many times you watch, the Democrat leadership in the state, go outside of representative government for the answer because they don't like what representative government will tell them. You got the governor of the state of Connecticut, when he closed down the state, he had to figure out how to reopen things, I guess. It was too complicated. So he hired an out-of-state consulting firm, Boston Consulting, spent $2 million of yours and mine tax dollars to go ahead and figure out a plan to reopen the state. What do you need that for? You have a state government. You have an elected body for that express purpose.
Well, and also brought in the CEO of Pepsi. Like, what do they know about pandemic management?
Right.
It was all just a bunch of friends of his that he brought together so that he could have some kind of veneer of experts being involved in these decisions. And even then they had to go to an outside consulting firm as if this outside consulting firm had some sort of special knowledge. And this is from a governor who campaigned going, we have the best and brightest and most educated population in the country right here in Connecticut.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is progressivism. I think I may have talked about this with you before, but people need to keep their eye open for what progressivism is. I think that it's not just far left leaning or authoritarian or more collective policy. It is also this notion that we're going to get away from our American system, which is based on representation and the people holding their elected officials accountable and being responsible for making the policy. Progressivism is the idea that we're going to take some experts behind closed doors and they're going to be in charge of making decisions, and the elected people will have very little say. And we're witnessing that in so many different ways. You got the governor has now been granted authority to give his public health commissioner the authority to determine what vaccines are going to be required for school kids. That's something that in my opinion ought to be debated at the legislative level. You've got our electric rates is another topic that comes up all the time. I always use it as an example because we used to in the legislature vote on electric rates. Wouldn't that be better to be able to hold your elected person accountable when your Eversource bill is going through the roof? Nope. They transferred that authority over to a regulatory body called PURA. And that just allows the legislators to wash their hands of it. They can continue to pass bad policy over and over that is driving up those electric rates, but the electric rates, they can't be tracked back to them because it's, that wasn't me,
Yeah, exactly. Well, Senator Sampson, we're up against the clock. I got to let you go, but I want to thank you very much for your time, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again soon, okay?
It's always my pleasure. Thanks, Steve.